The last thing you want to do when you interview someone on your podcast is ask bad questions. Bad questions are going to have your guests smiling on the outside, but cringing on the inside. And all they're going to be thinking about is how long is left in this interview and what am I having for dinner? And I don't think you want to be in that position, do you? If we're meeting for the first time, my name is Rich Cardona. I've had multiple podcasts, millions of downloads, and my team and I currently produce some of the world's top podcasts out there. So I promise you, this is coming from experience. Now, you and I both know that podcast seems easy at first, but there's all kinds of booby traps that are associated with it. And one of them is getting super discouraged when you have a bad interview because you didn't ask the right questions. So today I'm going to share 5 terrible questions that you could get out of your system immediately so that way you could level up as a podcast host. So let's get started. Now, before we get started, know that this video is part of a playlist called How to Start a Podcast, which has a ton of information that I think is going to help make you a better podcaster. So check it out. Now I'm here in Wilmington, North Carolina in a new studio, so forgive the mess. But before we get into the 5 questions that you don't want to ask, I got to tell you what comprises a bad question so that way you could be on the lookout for them in advance. If someone can answer your question with a simple yes or no, don't ask that question. This does not allow the guest to get deep and real with you, and this is called a close-ended question. An example of that is, do you love what you do? If it's irrelevant, don't ask the question. If it's out of the guest's expertise or something they just don't know about, it could definitely come across as disrespectful like this.
I'm going to ask you this, and it's embarrassing for me to ask you this, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Are you a virgin? How could you ask me that question?
If it's too generic, don't ask the question. All you're going to get is a completely canned and underwhelming response that does nothing for you and nothing for the guest. If it's too personal, do not ask the question like this.
I'm really happy for you. I'm gonna let you finish. But Beyonce had one of the best videos of all time.
Let me ask something. I was fortunate enough to meet your mom. What do you think she would have said about this?
So here's a recap. If it's close-ended, generic, irrelevant, or too personal, do not ask those questions. All right, now that we got that out of the way, it's time to cover the 5 questions you absolutely must avoid as a podcast host, and we'll start with the most generic one, which is, how are you?
How are you?
There's nothing wrong with asking someone how they are, but don't make it part of the podcast interview. It's for 2 reasons. One, you could do that during your warm-up before you're actually recording. You could do your pleasantry and be nice-mannered and all that good stuff. Ask them how they are, no problem. If you do it during an interview, it's gonna seem like you're nervous or maybe you're unprepared and that you're just trying to get something going so you could collect yourself. If you're well prepared, you're not gonna ask something that open-ended and that generic. Plus, it's not a value to the audience whatsoever. So instead of asking someone, how are you, ask them, what has been the favorite part of your month so far? Or what has been the best part of your week so far? Something like that is gonna be far more interesting. Number 2, and I am such a hater on this one, is can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself? You have no idea what this person is gonna say, and it's usually gonna go in one of 2 places. One, well, I grew up in Morristown, New Jersey, and I was in Little League for 2 years, and they're gonna go through their whole life story, and then you're gonna find yourself in a position where you're like, gonna have to interrupt them, and you're not gonna know how to do that if you're not a pro or if you've not been podcasting for a long time. The second direction it could go is if it is the most unbelievably canned, condensed answer, and that's not gonna be a benefit for the audience whatsoever. It is your job as the host to make the guest interesting. Gather all the things you can prior to meeting with them, and the interview is for questions that you can't answer. Anything else is stuff that you will comment on or you will do in an introduction, not while they're there. You will make all that known in the introduction so that your audience has an idea of who they're listening to. Instead of asking, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself? Ask them, what is something about you that you want more people to know? Hey, if you're enjoying this so far, consider subscribing and hitting the bell so that way you can get more information like this. If this applies to other podcasters that you might know, definitely send it to them. I'd deeply appreciate it. Let's get to number 3. Number 3 is asking the question, why? It took me years to realize why is not only kind of lazy, it's super low-hanging fruit, but also that it could actually feel judgmental and put someone on the defensive. Here's an example. If someone were to ask you, an aspiring podcaster or podcaster, like, why do you have a podcast? Or why are you starting a podcast? Some people might not blink an eye and go right into exactly why they're doing it. Other people might think that the interviewer is projecting something, that podcasting is overcrowded, podcasting is too hard, everyone quits podcasting, all these different things. And if the person getting interviewed feels that, they're not going to give you their best from that point forward. So instead of asking why questions, start asking what questions. So instead of asking why are you starting a podcast, you could say something like, I'm so interested in understanding what made you want to start a podcast. And that kind of just like, it doesn't feel judgmental, it doesn't feel offensive, and it's more inquisitive and curious than anything. The fourth question you need to stop asking immediately is, what would you tell your 18-year-old self? Now, Ellie, my director of operations, is like, given the right context, that's a fair question. If you are a young person, for example, and you are the age of the person asking that question. However, it is so much more common than people think, and it is a question that they have been asked so many times. You are going to get a just polished, ridiculous answer that's going to be uninteresting. What are you trying to achieve by asking that question? You think you are going to be super introspective and they're going to give you something they haven't given anyone before. Well, let me break it to you. The goal of a podcast is to ask the interviewer questions that they haven't been asked and to make them feel like this was truly memorable and I had a great conversation, not a podcast. Instead of asking, what would you tell your 18-year-old self? Ask them, in 10 years, how will you know if you've succeeded in your goals? The last question that I would love for you to stop asking is, what keeps you up at night? Again, this feels like you're asking an amazing question and you're gonna get an amazing answer, and chances are you're absolutely not gonna get that. I just know there's better questions out there and I know you want better answers. So these are the types of questions that we have to eliminate from our list. Instead of asking what keeps you up at night, ask what is something that used to bother you that you've overcome and how did you overcome it? That's a way better question and it's open-ended and specific. So let me know if I left anything out, and definitely leave me in the comments any questions you may have asked that actually fell flat when you interviewed someone on a podcast. And don't forget to check out our video on why podcasts fail so you can see what other booby traps to avoid.